You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joining once again Billy Galenko in the studio, coming back from a couple days of travel around the Greek islands. That was refreshing and fun, but I feel like there's a lot that need to be filled in about Billy.
Yeah. So welcome back, Brady. We had a bunch going on. You were gone. We've had a bunch of sellouts just in the past week, which is really exciting. And then also on the podcast today, we'll have an interview with Bartholomew Broadbent, who is the son of famed, basically wine writer Michael Broadbent. I think everybody has probably heard that name. Their name is also associated with Broadbent Selections. They make their own wines, or they kind of work as a negociant and sell them around the world. So really fascinating conversation. The type of kind of like a wine family that has such a storied history, like the types of vintages that he's referencing that they would drink regularly was absolutely mind-boggling. And then his Julia Child story at the end was interesting. But when a guy can just throw out that I was having a conversation, when I was on a panel with Robert Parker and Julia Child, I think that's a good start to a story. So
yeah, it was definitely, for me, it was, like I said in the interview, sitting at his feet, listening and learning, and some great stories from someone whose family is, woven into the fabric of the wine world. So really cool. And then there's three collections. We did have a couple sellouts, some quick and some that have kind of been lingering on the platform for a little bit. But do you want to talk a little bit about what sold out over the last 7 days?
Yeah, we had the Vogue Musigny collection sold out. We had the Pomerol Rarities collection sell out. And then as of this filming, it was yesterday, or this recording, we had the Macallan 78 Red Series sell out. And that one sold out in way less than an hour. That was a really exciting collection. But yeah, so we still have the Bordeaux EP collection on the platform. Again, the goal for this one is to keep it open and allow everyone to have a chance to invest in these awesome entrepreneur features, which should be an integral part to everybody's portfolio. And then we're going to continue to supplement that with more collections coming up. We'll be announcing a number coming up here soon over the next week or so. Also, it's the end of the quarter, so we will be having the Q3 quarterly report coming out. Again, this is going to be a similar format to last time, more updates on regions, updates on just kind of an overview from the Vint point of view of what the wine market's doing, as well as some updates on distributions that I think many people have heard already.
Yeah, we're continuing, I think, to be really active with taking advantage of some of the upticks in the market. I know that the index for the fine wine 1000 is up from around 11% to over 14% now year to date. So we've seen some really strong movement across the industry, across the market. And so, yeah, I think we'll be able to announce some more distributions, especially over this coming year as we close out 2022 as well. So a lot of good opportunity coming up.
Yeah. No, I think, I guess there's two aspects on what I want to touch on there, but yeah, we got the Q3 report from the LiveX 1000, which is kind of a barometer for the wine market. And yeah, even in these turbulent economic times, the wine market continued to tick up. And it was also in the face of the standard doldrums, which happens in the wine world every August when everybody goes on vacation. Basically, the wine market tends to dip. So it was really interesting to see the momentum kind of like really increase again when you're going through September. We saw much of the gains in most of the major indices in September itself. So they were able to power through economic issues as well as people on vacation, and as well as some of these currency fluctuations as well. You've been seeing a lot of American merchants become really active in the European markets due to the strong dollar and the pound and the euro kind of dipping.
Yeah, if you look at every every chart over the last 3 years in most asset classes, you can see the macro events happening based on dips and valleys in the charts, right? That's just hasn't really been present in wine. I'm not sure if you would be able to pick out the events of the last 3 years, on a chart surveying the wine market. So yeah, really excited about the strength, and yeah, I think our wine team's doing really well.
Yeah. And then last note before I want to hear a little bit about your vacation. I would say last note is thank you again to everybody who tuned into our webinar. I believe the recording is available if anybody would like to listen to it. We sent it out afterward, but thank you for everyone for attending. And if you have any questions on anything that we shared, please reach out. But Brady, in the meantime, let's hear a couple highlights from your Greek gallivanting, as I called it.
Yeah, we didn't do too much bouncing around. We flew into Athens and spent a couple of days there, which was cool. Yeah, seeing all that there is to see by way of ancient history there. And then we took a flight to Santorini, maybe one of the more well-known islands, the Greek islands. You've seen pictures of the blue-domed, whitewashed churches on the coast. That was where we were at. The island isn't very big. It takes about 40 minutes, 45 minutes to drive, tip like kind of end to end. It's sort of crescent-shaped island. And we, did some exploring and some sightseeing and also visited several producers. I was really interested in finding out more about Assyrtiko, which is sort of the flagship grape of the island, even though there are, I believe, over 300 varieties that are unique to Greece. Assyrtiko has really thrived on Santorini. It's kind of the benchmark for that varietal Santorini wine. So, we went to 4 different producers. I'd say we went to 3 of the top 5 producers in the area. We visited Estate Argios, Domaine Sagalis. We visited Art Space, which was a really awesome producer that also was hosting a large art installation kind of in the dugout caves where the winery is situated. We were introduced to them because we had a 2013, so a 9-year-old Assyrtiko wine during our anniversary dinner that we had while we were there. And so then we ended up going to the producer, and we had a really awesome experience with the patriarch of the estate, who spoke very little English, but gave us, a tour that only he could, sort of thing. And so that was a lot of fun.
Oh man, that's fantastic. I'm pretty jealous. Yeah. And then you had, and we'll talk with Bartholomew a little bit more, but you were able to check out some old vines too, some vines, and have wines that were from, vines that were over 100 years old, right?
Yeah. Some of the, obviously individual blocks in vineyards have older vines than others. And so, there's certainly a ton of vines that are over 100 years old. I think some of the wines that we were tasting were from 140, 150-year-old vines. Yeah, they have a lot of really unique techniques there, I think. Just sitting on the kind of the patio and looking out over the vineyards, you could see maybe 3 different techniques in terms of the ways that they were training the vines, how they were, for instance, with some of the white wines, they're doing basket training, which is basically where the vines are basically sitting on the ground, and it's sort of a cone or a nest shape woven around and around and around. And so there's kind of the vine looks like sort of a bowl, and that protects the grapes, especially from the high winds that they have there on the island. And then there are also some more what we think of when we think of trellised vines in lines. Also obviously had those, and they also had vines growing just in rows on the ground, like splayed out, sort of like if you would think of maybe a pumpkin patch and vines just laying down. And the reason why they're able to do that successfully is because it's all volcanic soil in Santorini. So the soil is completely dead. There's no, there are no insect life or anything alive and organic in the actual soil itself. And so the vines are and the fruit are pretty resistant to things like, bugs and rot and these kinds of things. It only rains 9 days a year on average on the island, which I thought was really incredible.
Yeah, that's nuts. And speaking of the volcano side of things, fun fact that the island's a crescent shape because the whole island was once a volcano with the cone up in the middle, and then it exploded. And I was just double checking here, like 1600 BC ish, and the cone collapsed in on itself. So all you are is on part of the rim of one of the volcanoes. That's wild. And it's weird to think that also happened when people like that. That's recorded history ish. Like, people were living there.
Yeah. Well, it happened again in the 20th century. I don't know the exact date, but there was a obviously less devastating, but still devastating eruption that basically moved everyone back to Athens and the mainland until the 70s or 80s, I believe, when folks came back. I might have the dates a little bit wrong on that, but yeah, I mean, it was definitely a unique experience. The wines were, the Assyrtiko wines were incredible. Some of the best white wines I've had, especially with, 6 to 9 years of age, really, really incredible and complex and with awesome acidity. The only thing that maybe threw me a little bit is the alcohol in the wines are extremely high. 14.5% is pretty common. Obviously the acidity is really high. And so, some of that is masked, but it certainly sneaks up on you.
Yeah.
with white wines of that high alcohol.
Yeah, you don't normally get that because as wines normally ripen, the sugar, the acid kind of converts over a little bit with that and turns into sugar. So you don't normally find high alcohol wines with high acid, but that's one of the special things about Assyrtiko and those volcanic soils. So yeah, I could see that being an issue. I could totally
Actually,
understand that.
one of the, I mean, aside from the aged Assyrtiko, which was definitely the wine of the trip, is a blending grape called Athiri, Athiri, that is basically never bottled as a single varietal 100%. And Estate Argios, who we had a great tasting with, did bottle it 100% Athiri, and that was maybe the wine of that tasting. It was really awesome, but they wouldn't sell it to me. They said, "We don't have it." I was like, "You're pouring it for your tasting." I was like, "Oh, we don't have it to sell." I was like, "Oh," I couldn't talk them into selling it to me. As long story short, but that was really an unexpected and really awesome wine.
Nice. Well, I'm glad you had a good time. I'm glad you're back. We were getting a little tired of answering everybody's support messages. And by we, it was mainly just Nick, our CEO, was handling a lot of it because Jordan was gone too.
I'm back. I'm back and available. Back and available.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you back. And we're now glad to share this interview with Bartholomew Broadbent. Enjoy. Well, we have a very special guest today, Bartholomew Broadbent. Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So I've mentioned with you a couple of times, but we've had many people recommend that we have Bartholomew on. So for those of you who recognize the Broadbent name, he and his father are basically two of the biggest paragons in the wine industry in the past many decades. So we're excited to have you on, and we'd love to hear a bit about your storied background there.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my father, who you referenced, is particularly relevant to the wine investment world. And that's because Michael Broadbent, started the wine auctions for Christie's in 1966, and then started wine auctions in America for Hugh Blind, and then the Napa Valley Wine Auction he co-founded with Rob Mondavi, and he then established the Christie's auctions in America and also planted them around the world, from Australia to Switzerland to all over the place. So he was a director of Christie's until his death in 2020. But the other two things, he wrote a bunch of books. I think there are over 50 books with his, either written by him or partly written by him. And there are two important ones. The first one is called Wine Tasting, published in 1968 and continuously in print. It was last updated the year before he died. And it's the seminal book on how to organize proper tastings. But more importantly, for the investors, he wrote a book started off as a Great Vintage Wine Book, and then sort of subsequent editions, the third edition, they changed it to Michael Broadbent's Vintage Wine. And this is the most important reference book on old wines, on collecting wines, on how wines appreciate, how they develop, because of his exposure to old wines and the finest and rarest wines through Christie's. He basically, it was the first book ever published with wine tasting notes in it, and it goes back 3 centuries. In fact, probably the oldest wine is certainly from 1600s, so more than 3 centuries probably, and that's hasn't been updated in a little bit, but it is the standard reference. If anyone that wants to know what does 1961 Lafite or 1945 Latour, any old wine you want to reference and see where it is in its drinking trajectory, that's the book where you look it up. So anyway, that's my background. I left England when I was 20 to move to Canada to work for a wine agency, and then got recruited in 1985 to work for the Singleton family, who are a big port-owning family. And they basically hired me to start a company in the States to import their wines, but also to go around the US teaching Americans about port and Madeira. Port, initially. Then in 1988, they asked me if I thought I could sell Madeira. And I said yes, because I knew the fantastic history of Madeira in America. And so I relaunched Madeira for them in 1989, and because Madeira had been absent since Prohibition until 1989. And so we relaunched it, and I've spent the past 36 years going around teaching Americans about Madeira too.
Wow. Yeah. And then in Broadbent Selections, which is that kind of company there too, you have wines from all over the world as well, right?
Yeah. So I left them after 10 years to start my own company, Broadbent Selections, in 1996. Initially, it was just to start my own brands of Port and Madeira, which we did. You actually may see the Broadbent Madeiras going back as far as 1933, even though we started our company in 1996. And that's because I sent my parents to the island when we started it and asked them to source some spectacular old barrels of Madeira, which we would bottle with our own name on. So Broadbent Madeira started in 1996. Broadbent Port started, our first vintage was 1994. But then I got approached by some other wine producers, Konstantin Gunschram from Germany, and they asked me to represent them, since I didn't have to only do Port Madeira, since it was now my company, my own company. And so we now represent, everything. We've got 3 fantastic Burgundy producers. We've got 3 fantastic Italian wineries. We've got some iconic wines like Chateau Musard from Lebanon. We've got wines from basically all over the world: Chile, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Portugal, of course. And some of them have our own brands. We make Broadbent Vinho Verde and table wines in Portugal and Austria. But most of them, we represent 40 different wineries from around the world.
Awesome. Yeah. So through all of these, I guess, to build these relationships, to get all these unique and high quality producers in your portfolio, I'm sure there's been some interesting stories along the way. What are a couple of, experiences you might have had either going to Lebanon or elsewhere that might be interesting to kind of share?
Yeah, I mean, Chateau Musard from Lebanon is one of the most iconic brands in the world, certainly in the top 20 brands in the world. And it was relatively unknown back in 96 when he was actually very, very well known in England. He was a household name in England because in 1979 they named him Decanter, the very first winemaker of the year, from which they continued annually naming someone after that. But he was the first one. And when I started my company in 1996, he wanted me to represent him, but he wanted me to wait until my company was established. And after about 3 years, he said, "Okay, you've survived the crucial period," and he appointed us. But when I was growing up in England in 1979, when Chateau Musard was discovered in England, it was a Bristol wine fair in London and in England, and my father had a Christie's stand. I was sort of slave labor helping him. And Serge Hochard, the owner of Chateau Musard, came up to him and said, "Michael, I want you to taste my wine." The civil war was just too chaotic in Lebanon, so he had to find export markets. So he went to my father, and my father wrote about it in Decanter, because my father also wrote for Decanter for 433 consecutive months. And he wrote about it in Decanter and declared it the discovery of the year. And he handed me the glass and said, "Well, you must taste this." And I tasted it, and immediately, and bear in mind, back then our house wines at home were 1961 clarets, 1945 clarets. So I was drinking the very best of the best. But at that moment when I tasted Chateau Musard for the first time, I said immediately, "This is the best wine I've ever had in my life." And wow. I've never strayed from that. And it is now recognized as one of the greatest wines in the world, along with the things like Vega Sicilias and Grange Hermitage and Chateau Musard. It's in that sort of ilk. And as an investment wine, it's probably one of the greatest performing wines of all time. It basically goes up in value every year because they pull wines back, and as they release it, they release it. And the sort of current prices are up there with the first growth Bordeaux and the Fiets and the Tours of the world, because older vintages, you can buy older vintages from 1960s, which are in the thousands of dollars now.
Wow.
But they usually get launched at about $60, $70, and then they just appreciate every year. They go up in value.
Interesting.
When you're that young, having so many, like you said, incredible wine experiences at home and getting to taste the best of the best, was there ever a question whether or not this was the industry that you would be in, or was it just, it was so natural? From what age did you know that this was going to be your life's work as well?
Yes, stupidly, I should have been Hugh Grant or something and done an easy job of like acting or something. No, my parents never encouraged us. I have a sister who's actually now a High Court judge in the UK and very successful. She was knighted and is Lady Dame Arbuthnot, and so she went off on a completely different course. I didn't really know what else to do. First time I took tasting notes, we were staying at Chateau Latour, and I was 16 at the time, and the director said to me, we gave us 1865 Latour and said, this is the first and last time you'll ever taste it. So I took notes. I've had it twice since then, 2 or 3 times since then. But that's when I started taking notes. But after school, I did a cooking course. Then I went to work as a tour guide at Hennessy and Cognac. Then I worked for Harrods Wine Department. Then I went to Australia to pick grapes and work in a couple of wineries in Hunter and Barossa. And when I was in Australia, I met Mark Hugel from Alsace and traveled with him going to wineries, and his enthusiasm sort of brushed off on me. And I called home and said, hey, to my father, I think I want to go into the wine business. And so he said, well, okay, then come home immediately because there's an opening at Harvey's Fine Wine Merchants in Pall Mall. So I rushed home, got that, and that's where I met the guy who offered me a job in Canada.
Wow. Wow, that's quite the I think if I were to, I also did a small stint in Australia, but I was, Hugel would come up to me and be like, hey, do you want to check out some stuff with me? I would have been in.
Well, he was my age at that time, it's just not like teenager working in the wineries in Australia. We met, we were both working at Yalumba, which is Hillsmith Winery.
Big fan of Yalumba. Yeah, I was in the middle of nowhere in the Limestone Coast, so I worked with a lot of people who were like sheep farmers outside of what they were doing. So it wasn't quite as helpful as that. Well, that's so cool. Can you describe the wines of Chateau Musar a little bit more, just for those who aren't familiar with like the varietals that are in it and kind of what it's like, and then we can kind of transition from there because I'm still
well, they make a white and a red, and the white's actually fascinating because which are 2 varietals which have no links to any other grapevines with DNA testing, whereas every other vine in the world has links to DNA. And they're very unique wines. They're wines which age phenomenally. The oldest I've had is 1954, and it just gets more and more honeyed. It's a dry wine, but it gets honeyed and beautiful. It really develops kind of like the dry white wine from Chateau Yquem. And it's a wine which you can keep open in a glass covered to keep dust out. You keep it for 5 months and it's still going to be developing in the glass. The red wines are Cinsault, Carignan, and Cabernet Sauvignon. So in style, they can, in fact, there was a tasting group in Baltimore, Maryland, who had 3 consecutive weekly tastings. They do blind tastings. And one week they had a tasting of Chateauneuf du Pape's, 1 week Bordeaux, and 1 week Burgundies. And each time some guy sneaked in Chateau Musar to those tastings. And in each tasting, no one guessed it was not the Bordeaux or Burgundy or Chateauneuf du Pape. And they ranked it the best wine of the tasting. So after that, they banned Chateau Musar at their tastings. But I particularly like it. It's, if you're a person who likes Chateau Margaux, for instance, you might love Chateau Musar because there's an element of volatile acidity in Chateau Musar, which is, I find, very appealing. And there's a very subtle amount of Brett earthy character which you get in, which I like, or on some Bordeaux. Also, it's the most natural wine in the world. In fact, the so-called natural wine movement, which was established first in Italy and then spread around the world, the reason it was started in Italy was someone visiting Chateau Musar and seeing that they were making this wine without anything, and said, well, if you can do that in Lebanon, you can do that in Italy. And bear in mind that we would know Lebanon as one of the greatest wine regions in the world had it not been for the Civil War, because the Romans built the Temple of Bacchus in the Bekaa Valley. And so back in Roman times, the Romans considered the Bekaa Valley to be the greatest wine producing region in the world. And really, it's the birthplace of wine around that area.
Wow. Yeah, no, I'm working through Hugh Johnson's The Story of Wine, and I'm getting about to the end of the Roman period. So that is top of mind.
The Romans also grew grapes in England and basically invented sparkling wine. And today, with global warming, the English are making superb sparkling wines. And the top one is called Gusbourne. And I put that against champagne any day. I think it's making as good as champagne, if not better, in the category.
Yeah, I had a 2010 Whiston, maybe how you say it, Wiston estate, this past winter, and still the best sparkling wine I've had. Yeah. Really.
They are fantastic, and I would say for people, personally, I love old champagne like 1928 vintage would be fantastic. And I think these wines from England, the good ones like Gusbourne, would have the potential to age in a cellar. I'm personally anti-investing in wine for the purpose of selling it at a profit. I know it happens, unfortunately, and Christie's really created that market. My father created that market, but my father and I both shared the opinion that really wine is a drink and it should be aged to drink. And I suppose as an investor, if your investment fails, you can always drink the stuff, which is a benefit. But to me, I invest in wines for drinking later on, not for selling personally.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there are categories, like Bordeaux, for example, or Burgundy. There's some of these wines that do need that time anyway to age, and not everybody can have their full cellar. So that's part of what we kind of do here at Vint is we get the wines as close to the producer as possible, and then we keep them in pristine condition, make sure they're taken care of, and then down the line they will be resold and eventually enjoyed. But it's kind of along the way raising the awareness of these great wines and the vintages for people who may not have exposure to them otherwise. So on that note, speaking of exposure, can you talk a little bit more about Madeira and kind of what it is and why it needed to be reintroduced to the US? Also, I'm very happy that it wasn't in the United States until 1989, because that was my birth year. So now I feel like I'm even more one with Madeira.
Yeah, so Madeira was actually basically invented through shipping to America because it was an island. It is an island off the coast of Morocco, and the trade winds between Europe and America. And they used to use the barrels of Madeira wine as ballast in the bottom of the boats. And one day, one of the boats arrived in the state, Savannah or wherever it was going. They forgot to unload it. They returned to the island, tasted it, and found it was much better than before it left. And they figured, having crossed the ocean twice, it heated the wine. So to this day, we still simulate that voyage by heating the wine to 115 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 3 months. And also, it's fortified, so it's like a port. It is fortified with grape brandy. It became the biggest selling wine in America by a long shot. If you read any history books, not textbooks at school, because all references to alcohol are removed from children's textbooks at American schools. But if you read proper history books about the founding fathers, there's references to Madeira everywhere, because they drank Madeira all the time. The Constitution was toasted with Madeira. The Declaration of Independence was toasted with Madeira. It was the biggest selling wine in America until Prohibition, and then Prohibition wiped out the market. 95% of all Madeira was sold in America until then. And post-Prohibition, shipping had improved. The Second World War improved shipping, so the island never got rediscovered, and it became known as a forgotten island wine. And so it just never recovered. But back in 1989, when I relaunched Madeira, we did it with a tasting at the Four Seasons Clift in San Francisco, and we had about 400 people come out to this tasting. We had 19 wines going back to 1845. And overnight, the market was reborn. Before that, only 2 restaurants in America sold Madeira. One was probably Burns Steakhouse because they bought old auction Madeira. But the other one was Massa's, who gave you a choice between Chateau Yquem or Madeira with the foie gras. But overnight, the Madeira market, every single restaurant, A, B, and some C restaurants in America, in San Francisco, had Madeiras by the glass. Trevino poured 7 Madeiras by the glass following that tasting. One of the beautiful things is that once you open the bottle, it never goes off. The wine itself is indestructible. And to give you an idea of the investment potential of that wine, so I sold the 1845 back in 1989. We were selling that for $45 a bottle retail. And today it's over $3,000. So it's a good investment. And unfortunately, Madeira is very scarce. There are only 8 producers. We make a Broadbent Madeira. And sadly, there's just not a lot of land that you can cultivate because all the vines back from the 1700s, 1800s got ripped up and replanted with other crops that they could survive off. So Madeira is a finite product. And as the market grows in America, we've been seeing the prices go up and up and up. So it is a very good investment wine. Something we are very proud of at Broadbent Madeira is that we launched a single cask vintage Madeira. So we went around our cellars looking for the very best Madeiras casks, and usually Madeira is blended with different barrels to produce Madeira, but we found these single casks and bottled them as single casks, and that's been really fun. They're in beautiful wooden boxes and really meant for collecting. But as far as storing Madeira, you should keep them. It's the only wine which you should store standing up, not lying down.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, no. So I have 2 questions. One, when it comes to the more like mid 1800s stuff, like you can still find a few around. I've been lucky enough to have an 1860s one. Phylloxera, and was it powdery mildew? It was odium, I think. Had a big effect in the mid 1800s on the quantity that was available anyway, right?
Yeah, so odium destroyed most of the vines for a while. But then phylloxera in the 1860s, because of a trading between America and Europe stopping in Madeira in the trade winds, Madeira was the first place to get hit by phylloxera, which came from America. It's the bug which eats the roots of European vines. So almost all of the vines in Europe are now grafted onto American rootstock to survive because they're resistant to this bug. But yeah, that's right. It took a while to recover, and actually one of the offshoots of that was Solera Madeira, which is you find occasionally. It's pretty rare these days. But when the 1863, for instance, Madeira was really good, and since phylloxera destroyed all the vines, they wanted to keep the Madeiras going, the 1863 going, so they would add other wines to those barrels. And there was a law different to sherry, where sherry you just have a continuous addition. It's like a waterfall. You start with the young wines, they get gradually poured into older barrels, and you might have a bottle of 1863 Solera sherry, which would have about a centimeter or 2 left of the original. But with Madeira, it was you could only add to it a maximum of 10 times, and not more than 10% each time. And in the case of Madeira, what was added to the wine was older wine, because they didn't have newer wine to add to it, because all the vineyards had been destroyed. So Solera Madeiras, my father always thought the Solera Madeiras were actually even better than the vintage Madeiras. But
Wow.
mostly gone from the market now, though.
Well, that's a shame. Now I want to go out and search for one. But yeah, so I guess now moving back to like more modern times, when you're talking about some of the replanting, I was lucky enough to go there last summer. I dragged my girlfriend there. She had no idea what she was getting into, but she likes to hike. And for those who don't know, Madeira is a beautiful place, as well as, just making great wine. And there are these, it kind of just all comes up from this, or at least the main island, comes up from this central kind of high mountain range. And you'll see all these little terraces of both vines and now bananas increasingly, which is kind of a shame. I wanted to, just go give everybody like $1 so they'll stop growing bananas and grow grapes. But can you talk a little bit about like kind of the styles and some of the grapes that are grown there? Because it's very unique. And then beautiful.
It's a volcanic soil. It's a volcano that comes up, extinct volcano, and so it's very volcanic soil. The Madeira table wines are extremely acidic. They've had problems making drinkable table wines because they've been so acidic. They're actually beginning to perfect it now. In fact, we have Broadbent table wines made from Madeira as well. So the styles are, and by the way, I agree with you how beautiful it is. And when I tell people, when people say they're going to Madeira and they want to go and see the wineries, I say, look, spend a week there, spend half a morning seeing wineries, but there's so much more to see, and it's so stunningly beautiful. The most beautiful wine region in the world, for sure. And the cliffs are dramatic, and it's just spectacular. So don't spend too much time seeing wineries. But the styles vary from dry to sweet, and they make them dry to sweet using two different methods. One is altitude. So the sweetest grapes grow at sea level. Where it's higher up, they mature less, so they're drier. So the driest grapes grow fairly high up in the hills. And then also you can adjust sweetness by adjusting when you add the brandy to the wine, because you add the brandy to arrest the fermentation before all of the sugar is being converted into alcohol. So if you want a slightly drier Madeira, you add the brandy fraction later. So a little bit more sugar is already converted into alcohol. So the wine rate ends up about 19% alcohol once you've added the brandy, but you add the brandy when it's about 7 or 8%.
Yeah. So it's something that I think everybody should try to explore there. You'll see Madeira kind of broadly labeled. There's like rainwater styles, but then there's individual varietals ranging from like, you'll see Cercial, which is kind of the most lean, I guess, lowest levels of sweetness, up to what they call Malmsey, or it's maybe Malvasia, that's like the sweetest. And there's a bunch of really interesting varietals in between. But compared to other sweet wines, or at least to me, like this isn't a sweet wine, it's a fortified, but the acid structure that's in Madeira is so bright and vibrant. I've had met ones many decades old, including that one that was over a century old, and they're still so bright after so much time. I think that's a really iconic.
Yeah, and it's part of the reason that they live forever and they're indestructible. The hallmark of a great Madeira is that searing acidity. My father's desert island wine was Madeira. It's his favorite wine of all, was Madeira. Also, handily, if you're just stranded on a hot desert island, the Madeira is not going to be harmed by the heat. You can keep the wine in the trunk of your car all summer long and still be great.
Yeah, wow. And it just perfectly balances that sugar though. Like anybody who's like, oh, I don't like fortified wines or whatever sweet dessert wines because they're too cloying. It's like, you can have a sip of Madeira and it just cleans right off the palate. It's so good. It makes it a great food wine too. Yeah. So I could go on about Madeira for a while. I think we'll transition for a little bit here. So Brady was just in Greece, and you just did a talk with one of our colleagues about old vines. Can you maybe tell people, something a little bit about old vines that still exist that didn't have their roots eaten? And because some of these are still attainable at really kind of affordable prices these days as well.
Yeah, so at the tasting that I was doing, the seminar I was giving on old wines, two of the wines which I find most interesting came from Swartland in South Africa and Itata in Chile. And both regions have very similar stories of having been abandoned at some point. The conquistadors of Spain went from the Canary Islands and Madeira to Concepcion in Chile. They created the capital of Chile in Concepcion. And then, so the Spanish conquistadors brought winemaking over from at that time in the 1550s. And then the French invaded Chile and moved the capital to Santiago. And so most of the population moved to that region. And Concepcion and the surrounding vineyards in Itata basically became abandoned. Then the family Di Martino, who make some of the greatest wines in Chile. The Di Martino family won back in 2011, had an amazing score for one of our wines, 100 points or whatever it was, the top score. And they arranged a family dinner to celebrate this wine, and they poured it reverently and tasted it. And they all sat silently with the wine. And eventually the father said, "Does anyone actually want to drink this?" And they all said, "No, it's horrible." And so overnight they decided that they're going to go back to natural winemaking and not make over concentrated, over intense, over, basically parkerized wines. And so they then started expanding and looking for vineyards in different regions, old vines. And they found Itata had these ancient vines, probably some of them may have been planted in the 1550s by conquistadors. And they started, it was Pais and Muscat and stuff like that. And they started making these wines totally naturally the way that it would have been made in the days of the 1550s Spanish conquistadors, to the extent that they even searched the surrounding hills for farms or gardens which had old amphora clay pots which were being used as flower pots. And they sort of went to these owners and said, "Can I buy your flower pot?" And I said, "Sure." And they found about 300 which didn't leak and they could actually make wine in. So they started making wine, natural yeast, natural amphoras made from the adobe clay. And then well, it's not adobe clay, but it's the same type of clay that you get in the adobe desert. And they started making these wines and under the Di Martino Itata Viejas Tinajas labels, old wine labels, old amphora labels, and they're spectacular. And so you can taste wines exactly as they would have tasted 500 years ago, which is I find really fascinating. And then the Swartland in San Francisco, in South Africa, Sadi and Adi Badenhorst were pioneers of that region. Eben Sadi, in fact, got named by the winemakers in the world. It was called the Winemaker Award, which is given at Provine in Germany. And Eben Sadi won this award, being named the best winemaker in the world by all the winemakers. And he's making wines from these ancient vines. He's got vines back to the 1860s. And it was in a region called Swartland, which was the biggest wine producing region in South Africa, but that got abandoned during apartheid. And so when the new wineries came in after apartheid, they all set up shop in Stellenbosch and Paarl and places like that. So after working for big wineries, Eben Sadi and Adi Badenhorst wanted to have their own wineries, and they found that they could actually afford to buy vineyards and vines, and plus the vines in Swartland were actually still on their natural rootstock and hadn't been touched for years. So they're now making these great old vine wines in South Africa.
Nice. Yeah, Brady was just having some old vine Assyrtiko, I assume.
Yeah, Assyrtiko. I think many vines over 100 years old, but I think some of the older ones were 140 to 160.
We're in Lesbos, or what area of Greece were you in?
We're in Santorini.
Santorini.
Yeah. And so, we were drinking Assyrtiko and the blending grapes, Aetheri and Idini. And then they have a red varietal they're growing there, Mavrotragano, which, is a lighter to medium body red varietal that is maybe more of a table wine there. But
yeah, I would say for people, not everybody can afford or find some of these wines that are, were made hundreds of years ago or even 50 years ago. But like working in Australia as well, like if you see old vines from the Barossa, there are some of these wines out there that are, not exorbitantly expensive in the grand scheme of things. And you can taste wines that, are on their own roots. And for those who, for more context, like phylloxera, you might know the percentage better than me, but it wiped out a majority of the vines in Europe at the time. So vines that are planted throughout the world that aren't on, American rootstock, which basically means like they'll plant, say a Cabernet Sauvignon, but the bottom roots will have come from an American root to make it basically resistant to phylloxera. The percentage of those vines in the world are very small. So it makes these old vines very special for the roots. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very interesting you mentioned Australia because, in the Barossa Valley, you're right, there's a company called Cirillo, which has really ancient vines, and also a couple who make wine there under a brand called An Approach to Relaxation, which are very old wines. But also Tyrrell's in Hunter Valley has probably the oldest Chardonnay and Semillon vines in the world, because they are not impacted by phylloxera. They're protected from phylloxera because it just never reached there. And the way that they keep the vines growing, the oldest Chardonnay vines in the world, is that when they see the vine is getting too old, they will bend over one of the branches and bury it in the ground, and then it starts growing as a new vine, and they just cut it off. And so it's the same vine that has been propagated and reproducing. So they're very proud of Chardonnay, and they're the biggest Semillon producers.
Yeah,
they're making great wines, in fact, with Tyrrell's.
Yeah, we definitely encourage everyone to check out Tyrrell's. Definitely their Semillon. I guess their Chardonnay too. I haven't had that. Yeah, we saw some I was in Slovenia earlier this year, and we saw some old vines, and their old vines kind of just grow up these buildings, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's like in Itata and up the trees, and you can't get your arms around them. They're so thick, some of them.
Yeah, but can you, aside from just being old and having their own roots, can you describe like kind of, I know it's hard to blanket statement, but some of the quality of the wines, like what's different from a wine that's made from really old vines versus like, one that's 10, 20 years maybe?
There's a depth that you get from old vines, a wisdom you get from old vines. Wines are like people. They when a grape vine is young, they're producing a lot of grapes, so it's a really abundant sort of fruity wine. And the more grapes per vine, the lighter in ways that the wine's going to be, because it's getting plenty of water. But when the vine is 120 years old, it really struggles to get any nutrition. It works so hard for each grape that it just produces a wine that it's got just so much more quality than a young, vibrant wine. And like the old vines at Chateau Musard, the white vines, they get one glass per vine, which is the same yield as Chateau Yquem when they're making sweet wines, because their wines are shriveled up and they don't get much juice out of them either. But the older the vine, the more it struggles. So the greater the depth and the elegance that comes out of those wines is also, I think, to do with the old vines.
Yeah, I've always found that the flavor tends to be like deeper, like you're saying, more concentrated. The tannins almost, if it's a red wine, tend to be a little bit more integrated, or they're just like refined. And then
I'm talking not concentrated, not in the way that some people might think of concentrated. Some California cabs are just intensely concentrated, but that's a different sort of concentration. This is a concentration of elegance and charm as opposed to just obviousness.
Yeah, like complexity concentration. It's hard to
complexity is really the word that you get out of all wines. It's complexity, and complex. If you say a wine and it's complex in your Master of Wine exam, you don't get very many points for that, because you have to be able to explain why the wine is complex in what way. But complexity is what you get from old wines, basically.
And maybe length and depth also, just speaking, especially length, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Precisely, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, and the other interesting feature is that they've grown for so long and their roots can go so far down that even in variable years, the old vines tend to be the most consistent and produce continuous quality as well. So
yeah, and they get different nutrients. The deeper the vine goes, it gets different nutrients than the ones which are just surface vines.
Awesome. So we're getting closer to the end of time here. I just have one thing I definitely want to hit on before we go is, so I had one question about sustainability with some of the producers. You work with producers all over the world, or you tasted at least recently. What have you seen that some producers, maybe especially in like Portugal, are doing that are proactive sustainability type efforts? And then what are you seeing in other regions where people are going to having to react to new climate conditions?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things which we require are basically 5 or 6 absolutes. If you look at our website, broadbent.com, and you see all the wines we represent, one of the things we require is they have to be family owned. They have to be making the very, very best wines in the region, or equal to the peers of the greatest wines for the region. But they also have to be natural as possible. So we represent Barbersville in Virginia. We sell it in all the other states with the exception of Virginia. And Barbersville, obviously Virginia, you can't make a natural wine because of the humidity, but you can still make a wine as naturally as possible by just adjusting for the one thing you can't escape, which is humidity. So all of wines we represent are very conscious of sustainability, and we have a list of organic wines, we have a list of natural wines, but sustainability is very important. I was just actually listening to, on my Facebook, I put this morning a podcast with an interview with Markus Huber from Austria, and they were talking about how he's sustainable, and it's very much of the concern of the wineries, which almost all the wineries represent are very concerned about that. Of course, the biggest fear they all have is global warming. Even in Lebanon, where you think all of this trouble and strife they get there, they still say global warming is what worries them the most.
Makes sense. Well, I don't think we mentioned this before, but I'm originally from Virginia, and Brady just moved from Richmond not too long ago. So happy to give Virginia wines a shout out. So have you seen any of these producers doing anything specifically to mitigate climate change already, or are they just trying to continue to do their natural, facilitate, like growing the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are picking grapes these days a month earlier, in some cases becoming 2 months earlier than it used to be. Of course, the only people who are not really complaining about this are the English producers who've been given the blessing from this, because now they're making great wines, which they couldn't do before.
Maybe German Pinot Noir producers too, Spätburgunder guys.
But it is, I suppose, some of them are looking at varieties which are going to be more able to cope with hotter climates. But yeah, I think we're heading into trouble. But
with your experience in South Africa, I was listening to a podcast recently where a Napa winemaker was like, we're preparing for the future where it's going to be warmer in Napa. We've planted some Touriga Nacional and we've planted Chenin. And I was like, I don't know if I would have gone Chenin right away for a warm climate, but what is your take from basically what you've seen in South Africa? I know that's warmer overall than like the Loire.
Chenin was known as Steen in South Africa. And actually, it's not something they've been planting recently. It's been planted for hundreds of years in South Africa. So it's probably the biggest single plant variety in South Africa.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think, in Swartland, they don't even have to look for those varieties like Touriga Nacional, because in the Swartland, they used to make the so-called ports and sherries of South Africa in that region. So those regions actually already have old vines from those varieties. So they are finding that they are making great wines out of those Portuguese varieties, Barocca and others.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was mainly saying, like, I know Steen is widely planted in South Africa, and I think that climate tends to be, when I think of Chenin Blanc or Chenin, I think of the Loire Valley, and I think of South Africa first too, and the climates are very different. So I was just wondering what your perspective is for Chenin as a warmer climate grape as a whole. Like, is that something, like, if I was like, I'm going to plant a warm climate white wine or white varietal, Chenin just doesn't seem to come top of mind to me. Does it make sense to you?
I mean, South Africa is a warm climate, I suppose, but it isn't hot like parts of Australia. I've never seen it hot like that. So I don't think that's the case. Beaumont probably makes the greatest of the Shenans in South Africa, and that's in Bot River, and I don't really see it as a hot climate. It's fairly almost Mediterranean to me. So it sort of echoes more. Yeah. Also Chardonnay, De Wetsoff makes the top Chardonnay in South Africa, and their cuttings came from Drouin's Clos de Mouche, and they're grown on limestone soil, just like Drouin in the Beaune is. So I think South Africa actually has the ideal climate for winemaking. Their biggest problems are droughts, really. That's the biggest problem, and it's lack of rain more than heat, I think.
That makes sense. Yeah, I know when you get I'm thinking a little more inland there, like the Robertson type area, and a little bit more where they used to plant more wines for distillation, that it gets a little hot. But yeah, for the most part, it is optimal growing conditions.
The Wetsoff, that's where they are in the Robertson. Have you had the limestone Chardonnay?
I have not.
I'm not a huge fan of most Chardonnays, but these were planted, and I love white Burgundy, obviously, and these vines came from Burgundies, and limestone Chardonnay is my everyday white wine at home right now, and it's really, really great. They're making great Chardonnay in that region. Really terrific.
Wow, I'll have to check it out. Well, awesome. Those are all my questions. Thanks so much for your time, Brady. Do you have anything else you want to ask? Any go-to wine questions or anything?
This was great. I mean, I'm sitting at the feet and taking it all in. So I appreciate you sharing, especially around Madeira. Now I'm really starting to run out of space, but I like that Madeira we can just store on the shelf. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's very versatile. You can drink Madeira with anything.
Yeah.
I was doing a tasting, the Food and Wine Classic in Aspen. On my Madeira tasting, my panel had Robert Parker on it and Julia Child. And right before the tasting, Julia came up to me and said, "Bananas, you've got to have bananas." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The greatest food and wine pairing in the world is bananas and Madeira." So I was a little Nell, and I told the manager, "We've got to have bananas." So I think they went to a store and bought them and sliced them up and put them in front of all tasters. And at the end of a tasting, one of the audience members said, "Can I ask a question?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "Why do we have bananas in front of us?" And I said, "Oh, right. Julia, do you want to tell them why you wanted to have bananas with the Madeira?" And she said, "Oh dear, I can't remember."
That'll be the clip out for this episode, and ending on a Julia Child story.
Right.
That's hilarious. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bartholomew. I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, that was our interview with Bartholomew Broadbent. Stay tuned for the Vint quarterly report that'll be out in the next weeks. We'll also be announcing new collections, and go out and try some Madeira. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Vint podcast. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.